The sun hung low in the sky, painting streaks of gold and crimson across the sleepy town of Greenridge. Jake Steele Henderson feared nothing and respected no one. As the ruthless leader of a biker gang, he had spent years taking what he wanted, leaving chaos in his wake. To him, kindness was weakness, and cruelty was just another way to show power. So when he rode into the quiet town of Greenridge, he saw nothing but another place to push around, another town too afraid to stand up to him. Then, he kicked a dog for fun. A small, harmless mutt, lying peacefully in the sun. Jake thought it was nothing, but he had no idea who that dog belonged to. And in Greenridge, some mistakes come with a price. The sun hung low in the sky, painting streaks of gold and crimson across the sleepy town of Greenridge. The streets, lined with wooden storefronts and quaint homes, basked in the fading warmth of daylight. Shopkeepers were closing up, children laughed as they played near the old water pump, and a few elderly folks gathered on their porches, swapping stories of days long past. Then, the peace was shattered. The roar of motorcycles echoed through the valley as a gang of bikers thundered into town, their engines growling like beasts unleashed. Dust swirled in their wake, and the townsfolk turned their heads, their faces filled with a mixture of unease and irritation. The leader of the pack rode at the front, a broad-shouldered man clad in a weathered leather jacket, his arms covered in inked symbols of a life filled with violence. His name was Jake Steele Henderson, and he was known for two things: his ruthless temper and his absolute disregard for anything, or anyone, that did not serve his interests. Jake pulled his bike to a stop outside the saloon, swinging his leg over with practiced ease. He surveyed the town with an expression of smug amusement, as if he had already conquered it without lifting a finger. His gang followed suit, parking their Harleys haphazardly along the main street. People kept their distance, mothers ushered their children inside, and shop owners quietly turned their open signs to closed. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Willis, leaned against the porch of his office, arms crossed, his eyes locked onto Jake. There was no mistaking the warning in his gaze. Jake smirked. He had seen that look 100 times before in 100 different towns. It meant nothing to him. As he strode toward the saloon, something caught his eye: a small, scruffy dog curled up near the steps of the general store. The dog, a mutt with a mix of golden and brown fur, was dozing peacefully, oblivious to the approaching danger. It was thin but not starved, with intelligent eyes that flickered open at the sound of heavy boots crunching toward it. Jake stopped, looking down at the creature with a sneer. He had always hated dogs. To him, they were pathetic animals, groveling for food, wagging their tails at strangers, and showing loyalty they hadn't earned. They reminded him of weak men, the kind who begged for mercy when they were already beaten. The sun hung low in the sky, painting streaks of gold and crimson across the sleepy town of Greenridge. The streets, lined with wooden storefronts and quaint homes, basked in the fading warmth of daylight. Shopkeepers were closing up, children laughed as they played near the old water pump, and a few elderly folks gathered on their porches, swapping stories of days long past. Then, the peace was shattered. The roar of motorcycles echoed through the valley as a gang of bikers thundered into town, their engines growling like beasts unleashed. Dust swirled in their wake, and the townsfolk turned their heads, their faces filled with a mixture of unease and irritation. The leader of the pack rode at the front, a broad-shouldered man clad in a weathered leather jacket, his arms covered in inked symbols of a life filled with violence. His name was Jake Steele Henderson, and he was known for two things: his ruthless temper and his absolute disregard for anything, or anyone, that did not serve his interests. Jake pulled his bike to a stop outside the saloon, swinging his leg over with practiced ease. He surveyed the town with an expression of smug amusement, as if he had already conquered it without lifting a finger. His gang followed suit, parking their Harleys haphazardly along the main street. People kept their distance, mothers ushered their children inside, and shop owners quietly turned their open signs to closed. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Tom Willis, leaned against the porch of his office, arms crossed, his eyes locked onto Jake. There was no mistaking the warning in his gaze. Jake smirked. He had seen that look 100 times before in 100 different towns. It meant nothing to him. As he strode toward the saloon, something caught his eye, a small, scruffy dog curled up near the steps of the general store. The dog, a mutt with a mix of golden and brown fur, was dozing peacefully, oblivious to the approaching danger. It was thin but not starved, with intelligent eyes that flickered open at the sound of heavy boots crunching toward it. Jake stopped, looking down at the creature with a sneer. He had always hated dogs. To him, they were pathetic animals, groveling for food, wagging their tails at strangers, and showing loyalty they hadn't earned. They reminded him of weak men, the kind who begged for mercy when they were already beaten. The boy ran without stopping, his small frame darting through the dusty streets of Greenridge. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as he weaved past the general store, past the blacksmith shop, and toward the ranch on the edge of town. Everyone in Greenridge knew about the man who lived there. His name was Elias Kane, and if there was one thing everyone understood, it was this: you never crossed him. Kane wasn't a lawman, but he didn't need a badge to command respect. He had lived in Greenridge longer than most, and though he kept to himself, people knew his story. He was a veteran of wars no one spoke of, a man who had once been feared but had since chosen peace. And most of all, he was the kind of man who never let an injustice go unanswered. The boy burst through the ranch gate, not bothering to slow down. The vast property stretched out before him, the wooden house standing sturdy against the fading light of day. A few horses stirred in their pens, and nearby, a large, black and brown dog limped toward the porch, whimpering. Shadow. The boy knelt beside the injured dog, running his hands over its soft fur. Shadow shivered beneath his touch, his ribs heaving with effort. He let out a weak wag of his tail but could barely move. The boy looked up toward the house, his throat tight with urgency. A figure appeared in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered. Elias Kane stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gray eyes studying the boy and the injured dog at his feet. His weathered face was unreadable, but there was a quiet, dangerous stillness in the way he carried himself. The boy gulped. "Mr. Kane, it's bad." Kane said nothing at first. He knelt down, his strong hands carefully examining Shadow's injuries. His expression remained calm, but something behind his eyes darkened. "Who?" His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the boy shiver. The boy swallowed. It was one of the bikers. The leader. Jake something. He kicked him. Real hard. Just for fun. Kane's fingers stilled against the dog's fur. For a long moment, there was only silence. The wind whispered through the dry grass. The horses stirred restlessly. The sky darkened, bleeding from orange into deep indigo. Then, Kane stood, and without another word, he walked back into the house. The boy hesitated, watching as Kane grabbed his coat, slung his rifle over his back, and fastened the leather straps on his gloves. "Mr. Kane?" The boy's voice was small. "What are you gonna do?" Kane glanced at him, his face unreadable. "I'm going to have a talk with Jake." The saloon buzzed with laughter and drunken conversation. Jake, Steele, Henderson sat at the bar, a whiskey in one hand, a cigarette in the other. His gang had taken over the place, loud and careless, harassing the barmaids and throwing coins onto the card tables. Jake exhaled a cloud of smoke, stretching out with an arrogant smirk. He was in control here. The town was full of cowards. He could feel it in the way they averted their eyes, the way they shrank away when he walked by. He had no reason to worry. Then, the saloon doors swung open, and the air changed. The laughter died. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. Jake frowned, glancing up. Elias Kane stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He just walked in, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. The bartender stepped back instinctively. The locals who had been sitting near the bar quietly moved away, putting distance between themselves and what was about to happen. Jake smirked, unimpressed. Well, he drawled, taking another sip of whiskey. "Didn't know this town had ghosts." Kane said nothing. He walked forward, his movements slow and deliberate, until he was standing just a few feet away. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Something I can help you with, old man?" Kane's voice was calm, too calm. "You hurt my dog." Jake blinked, then let out a laugh. "Oh, hell, that mutt? That's what this is about?" He shook his head, grinning. "I thought you were gonna say something serious." Kane just stared at him. Jake's grin faltered slightly under that cold, steady gaze. "You don't belong here," Kane said, his voice as firm as steel. "You and your men, you don't belong in my town." Jake leaned back against the bar, still playing it cool. "Your town? That's so?" He chuckled. "Listen, old-timer, I don't give a damn about your dog, your town, or whatever little legend you think you are. I don't take orders from nobodies." Kane slowly removed his gloves, one finger at a time. He placed them on the bar beside him. The movement was so controlled, so measured, that it sent an uneasy ripple through the room. Jake's smirk returned. "Oh, what, you gonna throw a punch?" He scoffed. "Don't be stupid, old man, you're outnumbered." Kane tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" For the first time, Jake glanced around, and that's when he realized every local in the saloon had moved to Kane's side. The bartender, the shopkeeper, the old men playing cards, even the few ranch hands who had been drinking quietly in the corner. Not a single soul stood behind Jake. The smirk disappeared from his face. Kane took a slow step closer. "I'm going to give you a choice." Jake tensed. "You and your men get on your bikes," Kane said, his voice steady. "You ride out of town. And you don't come back." Jake's jaw clenched. "And if I don't?" Kane exhaled through his nose. "Then I bury you where you stand." The room held its breath. Jake stared at him. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Then, slowly, Jake forced a smirk. "This town ain't worth my time anyway." He turned to his men. "We're leaving." They hesitated, but they saw what Jake saw, that there was no winning this fight. They downed their drinks, gathered their things, and filed out. Jake took one last look at Kane. "Enjoy your little town, old man. Won't last forever." Kane didn't respond, and with that, Jake walked out of the saloon. As he and his gang roared out of Greenridge, the tension in the town lifted. Conversations resumed. People exhaled. Kane turned to the bartender. "Pour me a drink." The bartender nodded once, already reaching for the best whiskey in the house. Because everyone in Greenridge knew, Elias Kane had just saved the town. Jake rode his Harley down the open road, his gang trailing behind in uneasy silence. The roar of the engines filled the night air, but his mind was elsewhere. His hands tightened around the handlebars. His jaw clenched so hard it ached. He had been run out of Greenridge by some old man. The thought alone made his blood boil. He was Jake, Steele, Henderson. He didn't back down. He didn't take orders. And he sure as hell didn't get humiliated by some washed-up rancher. The more he thought about it, the more his rage simmered. He had let that old bastard walk all over him. That couldn't stand. His gang followed him blindly, trusting him to lead, but they all felt the shift in the air. They had seen the look in Jake's eyes before, the kind of look that meant trouble. After riding for nearly an hour, Jake suddenly slowed his bike, pulling off onto a deserted dirt path. His men hesitated before following, their headlights illuminating the dry grass and jagged rocks around them. When the engines cut off, the silence was deafening. One of his men, a scruffy guy named Duke, spoke up. "Boss, what are we doing? We already left town." Jake swung off his bike, his eyes dark under the moonlight. "We're going back." His men shifted uneasily. "What? You heard me." Jake's voice was low. "Dangerous. That old man thought he could humiliate us. That town thought it could stand against us. We're gonna show him exactly who they're dealing with." The gang exchanged nervous glances. They were used to causing trouble. But Greenridge had felt different. The way the townspeople had stood behind Kane. The look in the old man's eyes, it was still fresh in their minds. Duke rubbed the back of his neck. "Jake, I don't know. Man, that guy, Kane, he ain't normal. And the town's on his side." Jake snapped. "You scared of a damn rancher?" Duke shut his mouth, but the doubt was still there, hanging thick in the air. Jake didn't care. He pulled his gun from his holster, checking the rounds. "We ride back in before dawn. We set that place on fire if we have to. We'll make an example out of Kane and his damn dog." That was the plan, but plans have a way of falling apart when you don't know who you're dealing with. Back in Greenridge, Elias Kane was already waiting. He sat on his porch, his rifle resting across his lap, his sharp gray eyes scanning the horizon. He knew Jake wouldn't let this go. Men like that never did. And so, he waited. Shadow lay beside him, still sore but no longer trembling. His wounds had been treated. And despite the pain, the dog's tail gave a faint wag whenever Kane ran a hand through his fur. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then, the distant rumble of engines. Kane exhaled slowly. his grip tightening around his rifle. They were coming back. He had expected as much. That's why he wasn't alone. In the dark, figures moved in the shadows, ranchers, shopkeepers, even the old blacksmith. The people of Greenridge had seen what kind of man Jake was. And they had made a choice. They weren't running. They weren't hiding. They were ready. The first headlights appeared on the dirt road leading back into town. Kane stood up, and then the gunshots started. Jake never made it past the town limits. His gang was ambushed before they even realized what was happening. Rifle shots rang through the night, picking off their tires, forcing them to skid out of control. Horses thundered from the hills, cutting off their escape routes. It wasn't a massacre, it wasn't meant to be. It was a message. By the time the dust settled, Jake was alone. His men had either fled or been captured, dragged into town to be handed over to the sheriff. Some had begged for mercy. Others had dropped their weapons and surrendered outright. But Jake had fought to the end. Bruised, battered, and disarmed, he found himself face to face with Elias Kane once more. This time, there was no whiskey in Jake's hand, no smirk on his face, only defeat. Kane stood over him, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes cold and unreadable. "You had your chance," Kane said simply. Jake spat blood onto the ground. His body ached, his pride was in tatters, but his defiance was still there. He refused to submit. Kane sighed. "Men like you don't learn the easy way." He turned and whistled. From behind him, Shadow limped forward. Jake froze. The dog he had kicked, the same pathetic mutt he had hurt for fun, walked right up to him. And then, with all the strength he could muster, Shadow growled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't vicious, but it was firm, certain. Jake saw it in the dog's eyes, the same thing he had seen in Kane's. No fear, no submission, just quiet strength. And for the first time in his life, Jake felt small. Jake Steele Henderson left Greenridge the next morning. Not on his bike, not as a leader, but on foot. His gang was gone, arrested, scattered, or too ashamed to follow him anymore. His bike was left behind, confiscated by the sheriff. All he had was the road beneath his boots and the weight of his own humiliation. As he trudged into the horizon, he thought about Kane, about that town, about the dog he had kicked without a second thought. And he wondered, for the first time in his miserable life, if maybe, just maybe, he had been the weak one all along. Back in Greenridge, the town slowly returned to peace. Elias Kane sat on his porch once more, his rifle now resting against the wall instead of across his lap. Shadow lay beside him, his tail wagging ever so slightly as he rested his head against Kane's boots. Kane reached down and ran a hand through the dog's fur, exhaling softly. Some men learn with time, some never learn at all. Jake had been given his chance. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't waste it.
What do you think about today's story? Do you believe situations like this can happen in real life? If you have any thoughts or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any exciting stories. See you in the next video.